Sister Donna's scholarly work is very relevant to the anniversary that we celebrate this year. She co-edited, for instance, a volume towards unity, Ecumenical Dialogue 500 Years After the Reformation, which has just been published, I think, by the Paulist Press. She's very active in the ecumenical dialogues, especially in North America. The topic of her presentation is the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, ecumenical breakthrough, and ongoing challenge. So welcome, Sister Donna.
I seem to have a number of handouts. Well, they're not handouts, but they're show and tells. So I want to put them someplace where I can reach them. I trust you can hear me, okay? No, that's not going to work. How about that? Works. So thank you for coming. It's good to be here, and thank you very much for a most interesting presentation. I had not heard about the coat of Trier, so this is big learning for me. So thank you for that. I want to talk about the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. And my reason for focusing on that particular document is because of its centrality for this particular celebration. For Christians engaged in the search for Christian unity, the year 2017 marks two important international commemorations. The 50th anniversary of the International Catholic Lutheran Dialogue and the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. In this context, the International Lutheran Roman Catholic Commission for Unity has developed a report, From Conflict to Communion, inviting Lutherans and Catholic Christians to participate in a joint commemoration of this defining event in our shared history. This document grows out of the 1999 Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, which will be the focus of my reflection this afternoon. It's the first time such a significant doctrinal agreement was officially recognized by the churches involved. That's why I see it as an ecumenical milestone. At the same time, the text of the agreement continues to present both churches with major challenges in terms not only of expanding the agreement that has been reached, but also in bringing the agreement into the present. So two parts of that. I want to start by looking at why I see this as an ecumenical milestone. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the dialogue process itself. Some of you have been involved in dialogues, and some of you have personal experience in dialogue in terms of just talking to one another. That's one of the things that happens in a dialogue. So I want to look at some of the process because I find it interesting. It's also challenging and maybe a little bit scandalous at times. So just as individuals make use of passports or birth certificates to say who they are, creeds or confessions of faith are used to establish Christian identity. Where the earliest Christians were interested in identifying themselves as distinct from the followers of other religions, later controversies led to the development of creeds, confessions, or conciliar texts in which one church defines its specific teaching in relation to that of another. When differences are seen as serious enough to challenge the understanding of the gospel, to affect the teaching of the gospel, churches may seek to clarify their teaching by condemning the teaching of the other. This is what happened in the 16th century. Lutherans and Roman Catholics were involved in a dispute about certain aspects of the New Testament teaching of justification. In other words, how we come to salvation. They issued mutual condemnations which have continued to influence how each church sees the other. Over several years of ecumenical dialogue on this central Reformation issue, real progress has been made, and the dialogue participants began to ask whether the beliefs that were condemned in the heat of controversy are actually held today. Common experience. What happens in an argument? You often get a lot more heat than light. So the question was, did what was condemned at the time of the Reformation, is that what people today actually believe? That's the question. The question was central to a study published in 1986 by a working group of Protestant and Catholic theologians in Germany entitled "The Condemnations of the Reformation Era. Do They Still Divide?" So let's look at the dialogue on justification. The formal answer to the question posed by the title of that 1986 document was given in Augsburg, Germany, on October 31st, 1999, when representatives of the Lutheran World Federation and the Vatican met to sign a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. The signing was celebrated with appropriate solemnity. Am I too close to this mic? Okay. So it was celebrated with appropriate solemnity in Augsburg and reported widely in the media. Lots of celebration. In Canada, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a press release and provided input for various media presentations. There were several local celebrations, including the forwarding of signatures from Winnipeg, Guelph, Kitchener, and other local areas to Augsburg. In other words, we had lots of local people who were excited about this, and so they signed their own letters and sent them off. Similar celebrations took place in the United States and various countries, especially where local dialogues were active. So let's take a look now at the process which preceded the signing. For Lutherans, the doctrine of justification is the article on which the church stands or falls. It's the crux of all the disputes. From the beginning, therefore, it had been an important topic in official Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogues. Over several dialogues, however, a study of the various reports showed a high degree of agreement in both approach and conclusions. Thus, members of the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity agreed to summarize these dialogue results so that the two churches could be informed and make decisions about the degree of agreement that had been achieved. Monsignor John Rodano, on the staff of the Pontifical Council at this time, produced a book. Are you going to tell me something? Please. Okay, I wondered about that. I could hear my explosives coming through. So let's try that again. So Monsignor John Rodano had been on the staff of the Pontifical Council at the time that these dialogues were taking place, and he published a book reflecting on the process. So his book is at the center of my reflection on this part of the document. In his role as one of the Lutheran observers at the Second Vatican Council, Edmund Schlink published his analysis of the decree on ecumenism in 1965. In it, he maintains that the statements of faith formulated in the 16th century and their ongoing or corresponding anathemas are the greatest stumbling block against reunion. He notes as well that the Second Vatican Council Fathers had expressly reiterated their acceptance of transdogmatic decisions and did not intend to address those issues at this time. But he says, within the context of the council, at a transition point between old and new interpretations of these dogmatic statements and explaining them in their historical setting, would this not give us a new way forward? From the first phase of the International Lutheran Catholic Dialogue, it became more and more clear that scholarly and historical research was beginning to show an emerging agreement on the doctrine of justification. Thus, the report of the first phase of the dialogue in 1972, the so-called Malta Report, stated that today a far-reaching consensus is developing in the interpretation of justification. This could never have been considered in the 16th century. Further, this was in 1976, and in 1980, the dialogue statement, All Under One Christ, put it even more strongly. A broad consensus emerges in the doctrine of justification, which was decisively important for the Reformation. The 1981 dialogue on the ministry in the church called the doctrine of justification the central point of the controversy in the 16th century. The whole third phase of the international dialogue examined the doctrine of justification at much greater length and in reference to the church. In 1984, so that document published in 1984, interaction between the international dialogues and some of the national Lutheran Catholic dialogues was also very important. And here in the United States, the dialogue was particularly important in publishing a document on justification by faith, published in 1985. From the beginning, the international theological dialogue took place within the context of specific efforts to move away from centuries of isolation towards building new relationships of respect and friendship. Mutual contacts were initiated on a variety of levels. Exchanges of letters hadn't happened for centuries. Exchanges of letters, mutual invitations for observers at meetings, that was important. Exchanges of visits by leaders of the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council. Once you start meeting one another, greeting one another face to face, things look different. The decision in 1988 to have an annual joint meeting between the staff of the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity was very important, especially as they began to work through the details of the joint declaration. They had a basis. They knew one another. They could talk to one another. And this enabled them to get over some of the rocky road that they had to cover as they worked through this joint declaration. I want to take a little look at the reception process itself. According to a 2004 statement from the Joint Working Group on the nature and purpose of ecumenical dialogue, the process by which the churches make their own the results of all the encounters with one another, and in a particular way, the convergences and agreements reached on issues where they have been historically divided. This is the process of reception. While reception entails far more than the official responses to the dialogue results, the results of these international dialogues are particularly important because the purpose of the dialogue is to bring the churches together. The churches need to agree that what's been said in the dialogue fits with their own understanding, so that in fact, it's not just a nice idea. We do in fact agree on this. This is an important part of the reception process, but another important part of the reception process is what happens in our local parishes. If we just have a dialogue that's accepted at a level of church leaders, then what happens to the faith of the people? An important part of the reception process is to provide tools that will enable people in the churches, in the parishes, to learn from one another, to talk to one another, and to grow together in their understanding of the faith. So insofar as the goal of the process to bring the separated churches together, there's a certain priority to getting a common agreement between the churches. But at the same time, what's needed is some experience of unity of the churches, even now, but not yet. Only when such experience is possessed by a notable number of the faithful in all of the churches of the ecumenical movement can the reception process be validated in terms of a real growth in faith on the part of the faithful. While the strategies paper sees formal reception of the documents on ecclesiology, justification, Eucharist, and ministry as all necessary to move forward in Christian unity, because there was so much progress already made on the understanding of justification, there seemed to be a certain logic to working on this particular question. The actual decision, now this is interesting for you folks in the US of A, the actual decision to proceed with the preparation of a joint declaration can be traced to the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, which in 1993 was considering the possibility of taking unilateral action. Does that sound like the ELCA? They were considering the possibility of taking unilateral action, saying that the 16th century Lutheran condemnations against Catholic teaching were not applicable today. So as soon as the Lutheran World Federation heard that that was what the ELCA was thinking about, they said, I think we better have a common statement here. And so the Lutheran World Federation approached the Vatican about the possibility, the feasibility of developing a declaration concerning the inapplicability of the mutual condemnations, with a target date for 1997. They didn't quite make it, but they were only 2 years late, which isn't too bad for an international dialogue document. In February 1995, a joint declaration. By the way, I was working in Ottawa at this time with the Canadian bishops, so this is kind of part of my history as well. So in 1995, a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification was prepared by the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity. It was circulated, and the text was revised in June 1996 and circulated again. At the request of the Lutheran World Federation, some sections of the text were revised, and a final proposal was published in 1997. Now here's where it gets a little bit interesting, maybe a little sticky. In June 16th, 1998, following worldwide circulation, consultation with its member churches, the Lutheran World Federation Council unanimously approved the joint declaration. Good. 9 days later, the Vatican has issued its official response in a 3-part statement. Not so simple. The 3-part statement had first of all a declaration. The declaration was quite clear. It said, the condemnations of the Reformation era no longer apply to the members of the Lutheran World Federation. However, they went on with 2 other parts of their response. And one of them was a comment or clarification raising a number of specific concerns. And finally, there was a third document on prospects for the future, which expressed the hope for further work. Not surprisingly, the Vatican response initiated an intense debate. I have to tell you, it was intense, very, because those who saw the Vatican response said, well, did they really agree that those condemnations no longer apply? And then the Vatican respondents kept saying, but yes, we did agree, but it didn't seem like it was so because of the two additional documents. Even members of the international dialogue, they actually approached the Pope and they raised questions about the ongoing viability of the dialogue in light of the Vatican response. It did stir up a hornet's nest. And for that reason, it was agreed that they needed to come out with a further statement in order to, does this sound like any arguments that you've ever been in? Where, you think you've got it and then you lose it? Well, that's kind of what was going on here at this particular point in time. So the Catholic leaders consistently stated that the Vatican response affirmed the consensus reached in the joint declaration. It was clear that they needed an additional step before the document could be signed because they needed to be sure that everybody understood clearly what they were signing. So they needed an additional statement. And so they did that. They developed an official common statement with an annex. They added another little piece just to be sure that they had all the everything identified to further clarify the consensus and the non-applicability of the mutual condemnations. You have to keep holding on to that because that was the key issue that was being pursued in terms of this joint declaration. It was to say that what Lutherans condemned in the 16th century, what Catholics condemned in the 16th century, does not apply today. So the condemnations are gone. That was the purpose of the joint declaration. The official common statement clarifies the consensus that has been reached and identifies areas for further study, such as the biblical foundations of justification. And there were further studies on that. The relationship between the Word of God and church doctrine, as well as ecclesiology, authority in the church, ministry, the sacraments, and the relations between justification and social ethics. In other words, we haven't got it all sorted out yet. There are other things we need to continue to talk about. The annex reiterates the consensus achieved and confirms that justification, that the condemnations of the former times do not apply to Catholic and Lutheran doctrines of justification as they're presented in this joint declaration. In elucidating the meaning of simul justus et peccator, that was a key issue. How can you be both just and a sinner at the same time? I have a lot of text on that, but I'm not sure if I should do that right now because I think I may lose you. The differentiated consensus reads, in faith, if you're Lutheran, listen. If you're Catholic, listen. If you're other Christians, listen as well. This is the key statement. In faith, we together hold the conviction that justification is the work of the triune God. The Father has sent his Son into the world to save sinners. The foundation and presuppositions of justification is the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ. Justification thus means that Christ himself is our righteousness, in which we share through the Holy Spirit in accord with the will of the Father. Together we confess, by grace alone, in faith in Christ's saving work, and not because of any merit on our part, we are accepted by God and receive the Holy Spirit, who renews our hearts while equipping and calling us to good works. Very comprehensive statement. Both Catholics and Lutherans said, we confess this together. Couldn't have happened in the 16th century, could happen in the 21st. The understanding of justification found in the Joint Declaration shows that a consensus in basic truths of the doctrine exists between Lutherans and Catholics. This is identified as a consensus in basic truths. Got to listen to the language here. It's consensus in basic truths, not the basic truths. That's what happens in a document. It's a differentiated consensus in which remaining differences in language, theological reflection, and emphasis in the understanding of justification are acceptable because the Lutheran and Catholic explication of justification offered in the text are in their difference open to one another. So we don't say it the same way. We do have different understandings, but our differences are not contradictory. Our differences are open to one another. And that's where the difficulty arose with the Vatican response, because where the Vatican response saw the understanding of simul justus et peccator, just and sinner at the same time, they saw the explanation in the document. They weren't sure that it was open to one another. They weren't sure that it wasn't a divergent teaching. That's why they had to come up with the new document, the Annex. Simul Justus said, I'm not going to do that because I think it's too complex for this kind of an audience. What I want to do instead is to move on from there to say where we've gone since the Joint Declaration has been adopted. 1999, signing with much enthusiasm, and then where do we go from here? Because it's not an end, it's a new beginning. And part of the new beginning is an invitation to other members of other churches, particularly other churches of the Reformation community, to see if they could recognize the consensus that was achieved in the Joint Declaration, to see if they could recognize themselves as well in that teaching. The first group to come on board was the Methodists in 2006. The Methodist Council signed an official statement saying, we can affiliate, we can understand, we're part of that same understanding of justification. So that broadened the consensus. The second step in broadening, there were further conversations going on, but the second formal step in broadening the consensus was actually in 2017 when the Communion of Reformed Churches officially affiliated also with the Joint Declaration. So we have now a large number of Reformed churches that have recognized themselves in the Joint Declaration. The Anglican Church in 1986 had already produced a document on salvation and justification at the request of evangelicals in their own tradition. The document was in the Anglican tradition, didn't know about the Joint Declaration, but in fact said a lot of similar things. So in 2016, the Anglican Consultative Council also said that with this document, even though we're not officially affiliating with the Joint Declaration, we too can see ourselves in this. So here, that's why I say the Joint Declaration is an ecumenical milestone, because it has in fact brought together a large majority of our churches saying this key issue that divided us at the time of the Reformation is now no longer a stumbling block to unity. Now, of course, as I say that, you'll be aware, and I'm aware as well, of members of our own churches who aren't so sure that the dialogue group got it right. There's still ongoing conversation. There's still suspicion. But at the same time, it was a major, major breakthrough. I'd like to move on to the question of contemporary relevance of this joint declaration. The joint declaration concludes with an important affirmation. Our consensus in basic truths of the doctrine of justification must come to influence the life and teaching of our churches. And the conclusions of the Vatican response makes a similar point. It should be a common concern for Lutherans and Catholics to find a language which can make the doctrine on justification more intelligible also for men and women of our day. As dialogue commissions have moved closer to resolving issues which arose at the time of the Reformation, new topics and potential sources of division are being raised as modern society responds to advances in science and technology, developments in human psychology and social theory, various liberation movements, and the rapidity of electronic communication. Questions are complex. 3D printing of human organs, artificial intelligence, transsexuality, to name just a few. And the church's responses, formulated in isolation from one another, emphasize differing theological and pastoral approaches. While traditional interpretations of the doctrine of justification may seem theoretical at times and somewhat remote from contemporary concerns, is there something to be learned from Luther's witness to the liberating promise of God's grace and focus on a theology of the cross, which might help the churches develop together more consistent and effective responses to some of today's questions? Obviously, I think there is. As an initial response to the above question, I'd like to look briefly today at evolutionary science as a context for proclaiming the gospel in contemporary society. In brief, Christian proclamation, to be seen as good news, needs to relate to its context, its cosmology, or view of the world in which it is proclaimed. For Clement of Alexandria, Hellenism. For Augustine, Platonism. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotelianism. Ignatius of Loyola, Renaissance humanism. Basically, the context helps you to see whether it's good news or not. For many people today, cosmology is seen in terms of a scientific view of the universe, evolving over immense periods of time and through vast extensive space. How will the Christian vision be proclaimed within this new context? This is precisely the topic John Hott takes up in his effort to develop a theology of evolution. He begins by noting that Darwinian science is experiencing a rigorous renewal in contemporary intellectual world, and that people of all faiths, not just Christianity, are faced with the question of whether their venerable teachings can honestly survive the evolutionary portrayals of nature, humanity, ethics, and religion. He asks, hasn't Darwinian science placed in serious doubt the sense that we inhabit a meaningful universe? Or is it instead possible that what scientific skeptics often take to be the religiously ruinous consequences of Darwinian thought are in fact fresh openings to mysterious sacred depths of reality previously unfathomed. At the time of the Reformation, Copernicus had just begun to work on his heliocentric theory. Galileo and Darwin had not yet begun to influence Christian thought. For Catholics and Reformers alike, the first 3 chapters of Genesis were regarded as a literal account of the origins of the universe. Thanks to biblical scholarship over the past half-century, many Christians today tend to look for theological meaning in these creation narratives. When Genesis 1-3, for example, is interpreted in the context of the Babylonian epic of creation, the Bible's unequivocal affirmation of the goodness of creation and the dignity of every human being called to share God's Sabbath rest is readily apparent. And Phyllis Tribble's interpretation, exegesis, has shown that Genesis 2, like Genesis 1, depicts a basic male-female equality. From her research, it seems clear that the assertion of male domination occurs within the framework of a divine judgment on human disobedience and is a distortion of the harmonious relationship envisioned in the covenant formula of Genesis 2:23. You're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, covenant formula. Thus, both creation stories implicitly condemn the whole domination subjection pattern of relation. These are good theological points, but the text continued to reflect a basically static cosmology. God is outside the universe, calls everything into existence, earth, sea, sky, plants, animals, humans, one by one, each in isolation from the other. This doesn't fit with the contemporary scientific view of how the universe came into existence. Does this mean that God doesn't exist? Or does traditional biblical cosmology need to be reinterpreted? Can Christian belief in God be maintained in this new context? For Thomas Aquinas, a mistake in how creation is understood will necessarily lead to a mistake in the understanding of who God is. When Genesis is read as science, it will necessarily lead to a mistake in the understanding of creation. While materialist evolutionists, such as Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, would say that evolutionary process excludes the possibility of God's existence, Christian thinkers such as Ilia Delio, John Hott, Elizabeth Johnson, Pierre Terre de Chardin find evolution compatible with their faith. Their positions are supported by, first, a willingness to recognize spirit as an integral part of the evolving universe, something that can be observed and must be taken into account within the context of the process as a whole. And second, an understanding of who God is and how God relates to all of creation. John Hott identifies the importance of naming the kind of God who creates and cares for an evolving cosmos. In their efforts to find common ground with scientific skeptics, he says, theologians sometimes tend to concede ideas about divine power and intelligence, which may be quite out of step with their actual religious experience. Instead, he says, religious thinkers can deal with evolution in a meaningful way only if they do so on the basis of their own experience of the sacred, mediated through their faith communities. So don't concede, take account of your faith. The evolution of life forms has a clear direction from simple to increasingly complex states of being. Thus, Hott claims, the coherence and intelligibility of the cosmos can be discerned only by looking towards the ultimate future, not by dwelling on the atomic dispersion of the past. At the same time, he maintains, evolution is rendered possible only because of the temporal clearing made available when the future faithfully introduces relevant new possibilities. Evolutionary novelty, he asserts, presents a particular challenge to scientific materialism with its atomistic, reductive inquiry into the past. In brief, the universe is a creative project, yet unfinished, and because it is unfinished, it still has a future. Further, it's the vision of a constantly arriving and renewing future, which can suitably accommodate both the data of evolutionary biology and the extravagant claims of biblical religion about how a promising God relates to the world. You see what he's doing. According to Hott, recognition of the continuous emergence of newness through the interplay of law and chance in the evolutionary process is part of Darwin's gift to theology, a challenge and an opportunity to reclaim features of Christian faith too easily smothered by the deadening disguise of order and design. Specifically, he sees a new understanding of divine transcendence, where the reality of God shifts from the one who abides vertically up above to the one who comes into the world from up ahead, out of the realm of the future. This, he maintains, corresponds closely to the God of the Bible, who goes ahead, who goes before the people through the Exodus, exile, and return, who speaks to the prophets, promising to make all things new, and who frees Hebrew slaves and brings life to barren women. When the Bible speaks of the dramatic action of God in the world, it is giving expression to generations of human experience in which an unpredictable and surprising future has often interrupted the natural course of events. In this context, therefore, it is the future that is really real, and the most distinctive contribution of biblical religion to the human life and consciousness is its impression that reality should be shaped by promise. Authentic faith, he says, is openness to a divine promise, pointing in the direction of a future yet to come, anticipating the arrival of the reign of God and new creation. Evolution happens, Hott says, because of the coming of God toward the entire universe from out of an always elusive future. God is identified as the absolute future, an infinitely liberating source of new possibilities and new life. And the absolute future, moreover, God takes the form of an inexhaustible future, whose continuous arrival into the present is always restrained enough to allow the cosmos to achieve its own independent evolution. This is an intimate, divine absence associated with the motion of kenosis, emptying, self-emptying, as the horizon of all that is and all that is coming to be. God influences the cosmos by holding out before it new ways of becoming itself. Creation is conceived as an ongoing evolution in which every interrelated cosmic element has a unique and unrepeatable contribution to make. God's power and action take the form of persuasive love rather than coercive force. God loves the cosmos and all its various elements fully and unconditionally. Yet, love does not absorb, annihilate, or force itself upon the beloved. Instead, it longs for the beloved to be self-actualizing, so as to become more and more other. As the infinite capacity for self-giving love, divine power enables the integrity and autonomy of the other. It works in and through creation to bring life. This differs radically from all concepts of power as the capacity to dominate others. For Hott, this suggests a theology of evolution, which not only enhances an understanding of how the God of the Bible interacts with the cosmos, but also supports current scientific views of the autonomous, random, and impersonal features of the evolutionary process. Do you see how he's trying to invite us into a new way of looking at the relationship between science and faith? And he's trying to tell us that our biblical theology has some very key points to help us understand the evolutionary process better. Jesus' proclamation of the good news of the reign of God led to his being condemned to death. Did it have to happen this way? Could salvation have been accomplished in another way? Could Jesus have brought salvation by living to old age and dying peacefully in his bed? Ilia Delio thinks not. Such a scenario, she says, fails to accept fully the integral relationship between God and creation. Death is not merely the unfortunate byproduct of creation. Rather, death is integral to who God is, self-giving love. Without death, there's no fullness of life. As is evident in the 14 billion years of cosmic history, the giving over of life on behalf of ever-expanding creativity is integral to life itself. The death of Jesus shows the type of engagement which leads to evolutionary progress. It highlights the physical reality of God's salvific action. The cross is key to an understanding not only of sin and human nature, but also of the divine nature, because it discloses the vulnerability of God's love. With reference to the crucified Christ as the image of the invisible God, Jürgen Moltmann states, God is not more powerful than he is in this helplessness. God is not more divine than he is in this humanity. Everything that can be said of God is to be found in the Christ event. In brief, the cross signifies a God who is radically in love with the world and ultimately concerned for it. The cross is the unsurpassable self-definition of God. Walter Casper writes, on the cross, the incarnation of God reaches its true meaning and purpose. It requires omnipotence to be able to surrender oneself and give oneself away. And it requires omnipotence to be able to take oneself back in the giving and to preserve the independence and freedom of the recipient. Only an almighty God, only an almighty love can give itself wholly to the other and be a helpless love. In the weakness and powerlessness of the cross, God's love is shown as the power to transform suffering and death from within to new life. It's precisely in God's self-emptying love that empowers creatures to do new things, to evolve. Evolution bears witness to the fidelity of divine love. Ilia Delio states, because every cosmic death is in some way transformed into new life. And just in conclusion, while evolutionary science can be and has been used to deny the possibility of God's existence, some of the concepts it endorses, movement, novelty, open future, seem more consistent with aspects of biological theory, early Christian tradition, and Reformation insights than the static categories of thought which have dominated preaching and teaching over many years. Assuming that a religious response to materialist biology will be formulated on the basis of the experience of the sacred, mediated through each faith community. Reflection on the impact of evolution on contemporary religion and spirituality would seem to be an important area of ecumenical cooperation. To date, it's been relatively easy to engage ecumenically and even from an interfaith perspective on questions of ecology. But response to the intellectual challenge of evolutionary science has remained largely an academic pursuit. If churches are truly committed to proclaiming the gospel in the context of contemporary unbelief, the findings of academic research will need to be made available to the large number of Christians who continue to believe the Genesis narratives are to be read as scientific fact. Survey indicates that some almost 50% of the Christians in America still believe that that's how Genesis is to be read. And they go on to say that they believe that Adam and Eve appeared exactly as stated in the book of Genesis. It's a fundamental issue which not only enables believers to ignore scientific thought as unfounded and limits their ability to perceive the grandeur of God commensurate with the various aspects of space and time, but also allows scientists to dismiss Christian belief as outdated and restricts their ability to encounter the mystery of God at the core of the universe. Efforts to reconcile the long-standing gap between science and religion could well be seen as an ecumenical project appropriate to commemorate this 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Anybody ready to take it on?
Many thanks, Sister Donna, for this overarching review of the events of the 16th century, the 20th century with the discussions, ecumenical discussions, and the 21st century with its scientific findings. And I had a lot of, Desjardinian conversations in the last part of your presentation. Thank you very much. And it's time now for questions, if you have any. We still have a few minutes.
Yes, a question of during the late 90s when you were detailing the process of between the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity as we're going through the stages getting towards that joint declaration. I'm wondering if you happen to know, was part of the, besides trying to clarify and understand each other's respective understandings of justification and the eventual, the document's reflection of an eventual openness to those opposing voices or different varying voices, was the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was their hand at all present in the work of the Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity? Because I'm thinking the prefect at the time was then Joseph Ratzinger.
Yes.
And I can't help but think that something this huge goes by without this passing his desk.
No, you're very right. He was actually involved in the dialogue in Germany, and he was very supportive throughout. Although the actual conversation took place between the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity and the Lutheran World Federation, the final acceptance involved the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So they were both involved. And in point of fact, Pope John Paul II, when they ran into difficulty over it, he was one of the ones who wrote to the Lutheran World Federation to try and make it very clear that the initial Vatican response, the one that came out 9 days after the Lutheran World, he was making it very clear that there was an acceptance of the consensus. And they went on then to explain that their concern had to do, it had a lot to do with the question of how do we understand that we're both justified and a sinner at the same time. And so that was the largest part of the reflection on that. But they were very clear that they did have a consensus. And Joseph Ratzinger was involved in the dialogue in Germany and very interested in getting it through. This really is the only time that we have had this kind of an official high-level acceptance of any dialogue document. And then the fact that it's gone on to include other churches is also very important. So we're moving. When I first saw this, I said, Reformation's over. We have an agreement on the joint declaration. Unfortunately, not quite so easy, but things were moving. The other thing that's important has to do with the Eastern churches, because the understanding of justification in the Eastern churches, the Orthodox churches, is different. It's consistent, but it's different. And so they never had the same kind of a juridical interpretation that infected us so strongly in the Western Church. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, you responded to my question that I wanted to ask you about the Eastern reactions. Thank you for those responses. If we don't have any other question, then we would proceed. We need to thank Sister Donna for her presentation, certainly.